Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of The Engine Room. My name is Frederik and I'm your host. Today we have a solo episode and today I'll be explaining a little bit on how you can, the science behind creating demand in markets and in categories where they might not have heard of you or before they know that they need your solution. So before we go into it, there is a few concepts that's important to understand in order to understand, creating demand. One of them is obviously, there's two concepts really we need to look into. There's demand capture and then there's demand creation. So if we start with demand capture, that's typically what you see, a lot of companies doing. And the reason they're doing that is because it is fairly easy to measure, right? You would see, so demand capture, that could be paid search channels, so like Google search and Bing. It would be SEO. It would be outbound even to an extent, picking up the phone, sending cold LinkedIn DMs, that type of stuff. That's also demand capture. It could be, something that's been used very widely is gated content and eBooks. So get a download and then send a nurture sequence and then call these prospects that have downloaded something. That's really demand capture, right? And demand creation is then the art of making people come to you. So for a long time, it's the same, not the same, but it's in the same vein as inbound marketing. So it's a matter of, when you're creating demand, it's a matter of making people come to you. So you're marketing a problem or a category, much rather than you are saying, hey, book a demo and try my product today, right? So, a lot of companies are focused on this demand capture activity because it's easier to use, it's easier to measure. What typically happens when somebody is trying to buy a category, let's say somebody wants to buy, it could be project management software, then they go in and Google or on Bing or whatever, they type out project management software for IT consultants, right? That's a Google search, that's a Google search query. And then I'm able to bid on that precisely. And when somebody then, and this is a very high intent search, so then because of the intent behind it, that people are now, I'm looking for a project management tool for IT consultants. That's a high intent search. And then I'm clicking that, I'm signing up, and then I have my last touch attribution that I can point it directly back to Google search and say, well, this inbound form, and then hopefully down the line, this closed won deal is directly attributable to Google search. So that's the easy way. That's direct response. It's how you can, that's how you would typically measure something like demand capture, and that's why it's easier to justify the spend here. But then if you go in the opposite direction and you go into creating demand, it's much more a matter of, as I said, marketing a problem. It's a matter of marketing a category, and then once you market the problem in a nuanced way, people will view you as the solution to this problem because you're able to communicate clearly. Here's a problem, and communicate the nuances of this problem that makes the people that are sitting with these kind of problems, they feel seen by what you're communicating here. So that's the act of creating demand. That's the science of creating demand. Below that, there's a lot of stuff that we need to consider. But before we go into more in depth with this, then we also need to understand, why is it important to create demand? And as a note here, when we talk about creating demand, it's not necessarily that there is no demand in the market and then you post ads and now there is a demand in the market. It's not demand in the typical sense as the market dynamics of supply and demand. It's a matter of, you're building awareness for a problem and then you supply the solution. So it's not, you're building awareness for your brand and that brand supplies the solution to this specific problem. Right. Once we got that out of the way, we're moving back a little bit. Why it's important to understand the difference between capturing demand and creating demand. I can't remember which one, but one of the big four consultancies, they came out recently and said, and LinkedIn is promoting this a lot as well, there is this 9 to 5 rule in B2B. And what that basically states is that at any point in time, 5% of your market, 5% of your total addressable market is in market for your solution. And there's a fairly easy way to calculate it. It's a matter of how big is the TAM, and then how often do they purchase this solution. Then you can, if it's every 7 years, then the number of people that are in market at this point are lower than if it was every 6 months, right? So there's a fairly easy way to calculate how big a percentage of your, and it's an assumption, granted, right? But it's fairly easy to say, these are the people that are in market for my solution, right? But what you need to understand is that in B2B, this is typically somewhere between 0.5 and 5% of your total addressable market that are in market at any given point for your category, right? If you then focus a lot on capturing demand, what's going to happen is that you'll be competing with all the other people who are also just trying to capture demand. So imagine there is, if we just take an example, you have a total addressable market of 100 companies. They buy at, X amount of months. So the buying frequency is X amount of months, and that's going to leave us at there's 5% of the market that are in market for your solution. That leaves us with 5 companies in total. You will be competing. If you're just trying to capture existing market demand, you'll be competing with all the other players in the market. On the other hand, so 5% is not a lot, and in this case it's 5 companies total. If there are 7, competitors in the market, then right, there's not enough for everybody, and that's basically what it becomes. And if you're also just trying to capture existing market demand without trying to create it, what will also happen is that you will enter a race to the bottom, right? And that's going to be on pricing likely. So if you're just capturing demand, you probably don't have a distinct way of being different or differentiating from your competitors. So it's just going to be, we're the cheapest, here's where you can get started the fastest, something like that. And that's typically also what is driving, category buyers that doesn't have a brand affiliation before going into a buying cycle. They will typically just be looking at pricing. Where can I get the cheapest, as long as it fits my requirements and my needs. So that's one thing. It's going to be a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. What's also going to happen is that you will be entering a Google Ads auction, and you'll be driving up the cost of this because you're competing for X amount of market, and you'll continually try to outbid your competitors, and then auction costs are going to go up, which also then is going to reduce your profit per customer, right? CAC paybacks are going to go up. So, and customer acquisition cost is going to go up. So all that kind of thing plays into how this is just going to be a race to the bottom. And at one point you'll be acquiring customers at a rate that's not profitable. Basically because let's say they stay for 2 years, you paid 3 years worth of ACV for these people. So this is kind of what happens when you create demand. When you only go out and try to capture existing market demand. When you go out and you try to create demand, on the other hand, you're building out for awareness, you're building out for distinctiveness, you're building out for differentiation, you're building out for story, you're building out for a strategic narrative. So all these things you take into, and then you try to build affiliation with your customers, with your ICP, basically, with your target audience, with your total addressable market, serviceable, obtainable market. That's who you want to market this to. So once they enter this buying journey, once they become ready to be the 5%, then they're thinking of you in this buying moment. So another thing that's important to understand, the dynamics of this. So we have established there's a 9 to 5 to 5 rule. Everybody agrees. While it's not exact science, but it's close enough. What also happens is that there is a day one list within companies. So what typically happens before a company tries to buy a category, and this is not necessarily like a slip of paper where it's written down. It could also just be a mental list, but it's a good frame and it's a good image to have. There's a day one list, and it's typically comprised of 2 to 6 vendors that you have a preference for before entering into a buying cycle. If I remember correctly, 80% have reported that this is what they have. They have this day one list, and then in the case of when it comes to a purchase, in 90% of the cases, the vendor that was selected was on this day one list. So that's one thing. That's important to understand. That's also one of the arguments for why you want to create demand. Moreover, I think it's similar percentages. I can't remember. I'm going to misquote it. But something round, and in 90% of the cases, when the decision is made, the brand that everybody was familiar with was the one that was chosen, right? So that means you might be marketing only at the champion in your decision-making unit, but what happens when they go into the buying group, the CFO and the CTO, and they might be more familiar with another brand and that you're also familiar with, and then in 90% of the cases, the brand with the most recognition is going to win the tender or the quote, the whatever, right? They're going to win. They're going to win the deal. Okay, so there's a couple of things to understand here. There's the day one list, and then there's just the pure awareness, what do you want to call it? Pure awareness, mental availability play game going on here, right? Okay, so now we have this established. So why do we then want to create demand? Because we want to make sure that we are on the day one list, and that we are, the whole buying group is familiar with us, not just the brand. It's fine that they recognize our logo, they recognize the brands, recognize the colors, recognize the font. That's fine, but they also need to understand what we stand for, right? They need to remember okay, yeah, this brand, I remember that they stand for this. This is how they're distinct. Oh yeah, and we're moving into a place now where it's just going to be feature parity all over. So we need something different than just features to stand out on. There has to be a strong strategic narrative, a strong founder story, a strong reason for solving, something like that has to work. If you don't have that, then you'll be struggling to create demand. It's not just a matter of, pushing ads and saying, hey, yeah, we're doing this and here's why that's cool, try today. That's not creating demand. Creating demand is sitting down and looking at your customers and say, you have this experience problem. I understand because I'm able to formulate it, I'm able to communicate it, and here's a proposed solution. So it's not so much about just pumping out ads and shooting, pumping a lot of money into LinkedIn ads. It's what you say, and it has to resonate. So how do we go into that? How do we make sure that it resonates? Step one of that, you need to talk to your customers. You need to understand why were they buying you in the first place? What competitors were they considering? Why did you win? What was a trigger event inside of their company that made them go, now we need this category? What were the downsides? What were the upsides? Who was involved? All that stuff. You need to understand that. And you need to make sure that they kind of tell you, well, there was this specific reason why we bought from you. And then you want to translate that into a strong strategic narrative. And the strategic narrative is not a communications thing. It's not a marketing thing. It's a business thing. Why do the business exist? Why are we here? To fundamentally change how we do B2B marketing, for example. Could be. To fundamentally change how companies, run their daily operations when they have a consultancy firm. Something like that, right? What is the strategic narrative? Why were this company founded? What drove us to this? Why can't we go away? What was the problem that we saw in the market and in the category that we knew we had a better way of solving, that we knew we had a different way of solving? That's a strong strategic narrative because you can then build a following and you can build a momentum behind it. And that's what you need to do when you when you create a strong strategic narrative. And sure, there's a lot on like just pure awareness in, you know, in marketing, where we just need to make sure that we're top of mind when somebody is trying to buy. And that's part of it. Getting a lot of touch points in, getting a lot of, you know, show a lot of ads, getting a lot of impressions, getting a high frequency, good market penetration, all that stuff. That's definitely part of it. But it's not just the only thing, because you can run a fuck ton of ads and then you can say nothing basically in these ads, and then it won't make people buy, because you have to be able to communicate clearly that you have a very concrete problem that you know very deeply and that you can solve with this solution. So that's when it becomes a movement, and that's what you're doing when you're creating a strategic narrative. It's an overarching strategic narrative that drives the strategy of the business, right? For SparkForce now, I'm just going to say something. It's probably it's to this effect, right? We want to make sure that B2B companies, they scale better and scale more profitably, right? That's why we're here. And then there's a lot of subtext or sub things that goes into that, but that's the overall reason why we are here, right? So you want to create a very strong strategic narrative, and then this needs to translate into, and that's founder thing. Like, so you invite interview founders, you interview CEOs, you interview like the culture bearers and like the strategic, you know, what you want to call like spearheads, and you need to understand, why did this business even start in the first place? And then you get into the customer interviews, and then you can kind of build out content pillars for each of this. So what does the strategic narrative mean? It means something at this level. And then each of the content pillars that you're then building, you are making sure that this ties up into here, up into the strategic narrative, and that the people you show it to, that it resonates with them, and that it communicates, and that it addresses a real business problem that they feel on their day-to-day. And then you can always turn that into, posts and ads and all that stuff. So that's kind of how you go about it, and that's kind of some of the fundamental things that you do when you are doing demand generation, demand creation. In some cases, you are pioneering, and you have to, really make some waves. Then you are looking into something like category creation, and that's where like the real money are made. When you go into something like category creation, we won't go into that too much today, but this only means that your strategic narrative needs to be even stronger. And then you won't be able to, then you have to truly create demand from a non-existent problem. What you'll then do is you'll do what Christopher Lockhead has called damn demand, and then you take, an adjacent category and say, here is, a problem that you know and that you feel, and you thought this was the solution, but when it comes down to it, here is the real solution. So you dam the demand, and you kind of redirect the demand from an existing category to your new category. But we won't get into that. Okay, so now that we have this, so these are kind of the fundamental things: a strong strategic narrative, good content pillars, and understanding of customers and actual business needs. Now it's a matter of distribution, because it's not hard. Right, you can do a lot of things technically to drive down costs and do all that stuff when it comes to your ads. But now it's a matter of frequency, and it's a matter of distribution. Do we have a very strong strategic narrative? Do we have a very strong understanding of what problems that we solve? Then it's just making sure that this message resonates. No, we're making sure that this message reaches and resonates with the right people. There's a lot of things that go into that. It might be different for different parts of the buying group. Then that comes into strategy. How do we do that? You might look at, does this need to be ABM, or can we do demand gen? Different types of motion. But in reality, it comes down to, now we need high frequency and high market penetration, because then you're coming into the thing on like marketing is 69% awareness. And when they enter into this buying journey, or like this in-market stage of the 5%, you've given them enough impressions across the entire buying group to then now you're on the day one list, and you're the one everybody knows. And then when it comes down to buying, they're gonna pick you. So demand gen is not creating demand from thin air. It's a strategic way of approaching your communication and distribution. And it's not just gated ebooks. That can be part of it. Like, I've been hailing a lot of gated ebooks, and like, I don't like it. It doesn't work. It's flat out doesn't work. But it can be part of it, right? And it can work as whatever, a way to get some contact information or whatever. But you need to have the communications part solved if you want to create demand. It's not just enough to pump in a lot of money into LinkedIn ads. The communication and the messaging and the positioning, it needs to be there. All right. Thank you so much for listening to this week's Engine Room podcast. This was Frederik, and have a great day.